Let's talk about point of view. Point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. It's also the narrator's position in relation to the story being told. So that's two different ways to explain the same thing. Basically, point of view is the vantage point from which a story is told. So let's look at the different kinds of point of view and see how they affect authors' choices and how the story comes out. First person. The narrator is a character in the story, or a poem, or whatever. So first person narrator. There are a couple different kinds. The one that automatically comes to mind usually is central narrator. This is the main character who is telling the story as if it is his or her memoir. So they're the main character, they're telling you the story of what happened, and they're the main point of the story. They're our main character. There's a different kind of narrator who is a peripheral narrator. He or she is not the protagonist or main character of the story. So this is interesting because we get kind of close to the subject, but maybe we use this, an author might use this in the case that maybe the main character is, the protagonist is kind of unraveling, they're not mentally well, or we don't think we can trust their opinion, or it might seem really outlandish if we heard it from their point of view. We have a more objective character, that brings us really close to the story, makes us feel like it's really real, without actually having to go into the mind of someone who might be hard to kind of think like. So that's peripheral versus central narrator. An unreliable narrator is a narrator who fails to grasp aspects of the story he or she tells that the reader does grasp. So that's dramatic irony. Anytime a character doesn't know something that the audience does, that's dramatic irony. So lots of times the unreliable narrator is blinded by emotion or bias. So they tell us some story and they totally miss a key detail and they don't even get what's going on, but we do, right? So that's an unreliable narrator. They're really useful because they're a nice study in how humanity works. And an author is doing that for a reason if we have that unreliable narrator. Another point of view that is under the first person heading is innocent eye point of view, which is when the story is told from the perspective of a child. So you can imagine that the perspective of a child is also unreliable, right? So a child witnesses a fight between his or her parents and then relays that story to us. The details we would notice as adults or as people who are older than maybe a 6-year-old, they don't understand the whole idea of what's happening. So their interpretation is different. If the author writes it really well, we'll be able to fill in the blanks, and that makes it really powerful. So that's unreliable narrator. Any of these can kind of be mixed and matched. So we could have a central narrator, that's the protagonist, who is also unreliable and is also a child and would be innocent eye. We could also have a peripheral narrator who is unreliable or has innocent eye point of view. So all of those fall under the heading of first person. And again, using those pronouns, I, me, my, even we. If they're using we, that's first person. Second person is the point of view when the you character is a character in the story. So often the writer is turning the reader into a character within the story. So let's take a look at an example, which I think is the best way to talk about this. So this is a passage written in the second person. You're not the kind of guy who would be at a place like this at this time of the morning. But here you are, and you cannot say the terrain is entirely unfamiliar, although the details are fuzzy. You are at a nightclub talking to a girl with a shaved head. Okay, this is from a novella short called Bright Lights, Big City. And you can see that this author is telling us, you are at this place, you are talking to this girl, obviously we're not actually there, so it's a really interesting technique. It's kind of replacing the I, like you could replace all the U's with I's and it would change the feeling, but it would be kind of the same story. It's an interesting technique. It's not used all that much. I think it's used a lot more in poetry than it is in fiction, because an entire novel where it's saying you, that's not a choose your own adventure novel, might get a little bit heavy. But I think it's a pretty neat technique. You don't see it a lot, but it's definitely worth addressing. Third person is when the narrator does not participate in the story or the poem or whatever you're reading. It is not the voice of the author, however. That sometimes people get mixed up with this. Third person is not necessarily, it is not the author. It is a persona that the author is using to tell the story. So third person is broken into a bunch of different types of third person, so let's take a look at those. The first one we're going to talk about is third person omniscient. This is the case where the narrator is all-knowing. The narrator can tell the thoughts and feelings of all of the characters, and they relay them to you as is necessary to develop the story. So this is a very godlike figure. Something that's omniscient is very godlike and can see and knows everything about us. So that is that kind of narrator. These are using he, she, it, right? It's not saying I or you. This is using those types of pronouns. So that's what makes it third person. Third person objective is similar with the exception that the narrator never reveals more than can be inferred based on the story's action and dialogue. So anything that like a news reporter would tell you about something, that's what the objective point of view is going to tell you in third person. This is a detached observer that does not reveal the thoughts or feelings of the characters. They just tell us what happens. They can see everything that happens, but they can't tell us what anyone is thinking or how they feel about it. We can infer based on what the characters say or what they do, but they never actually directly tell us what they think. So that is third person objective. Our last one is third person limited omniscient. Okay, and this is neat. It's invented by my girl Jane Austen in a fabulous novel called Emma. Definitely worth reading. The narrator reveals the thoughts and feelings of one character only, so we get to see inside the mind of one character and nobody else. And this is a really neat technique because it allows us to have all of that objectiveness about everybody else, but get very close to one character. The characters whose thoughts and feelings are expressed is not always a protagonist, just like in first person. Whatever perspective we're getting doesn't necessarily have to be from the perspective of the main character. So maybe we're getting this from the perspective of the daughter of somebody who's going through something really traumatic or something very exciting. The narrative follows this one main character, but it's not necessarily the person whose thoughts and feelings we get, which is a neat perspective. Remember that authors make really careful choices about what type of perspective they're telling the story. So we can learn a lot about their intention, about the theme, about the tone, all of that stuff based on what kind of perspective they've chosen. So those are the different kinds of point of view, the different persons that we can take a look at. I hope that helps clarify. Thank you for listening.